Death at the Charity Bake Sale. Welcome to Silent Clues. I'm your host, Benedict, and I'm so glad you're here. There's something wonderfully comforting about sharing a quiet mystery together, no matter where in the world you're watching from. If you'd like, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I read every single one. Now, make yourself a warm cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. But before we get started, did you know that over 80% of viewers aren't subscribed to this channel? If you're enjoying these timeless mysteries and want more Miss Marple stories brought to life, subscribing is the best way to support Silent Clues. It's completely free and it helps us bring you even more classic whodunits. Now, let's dive into today's case. Chapter 1. The cakes arrive early. Dawn had not yet lifted its pale edge over the hedges when the church hall door swung on its stiff hinges with a sound like a polite cough that wished not to be noticed. Miss Marple, who had risen early to set a saucer of warm milk for a neighbour's thin cat, heard that discreet complaint travel across the frosted green like a needle run softly through canvas. She looked up from her garden path and saw the faintest ribbon of light slip along the hall's lower panes, then vanish as though a hand had shaded it. The village would have said there was no one about, for no one sensible is willingly up before the dairyman and the post. Yet St. Mary Mead does not always wait upon the sensible, and the wind carries small truths more briskly than letters. By the time Miss Marple had tied her scarf and crossed to the porch, cold biting at the knuckles of her gloves, the hall door stood ajar by an inch, and there was the agreeable but unexpected perfume of vanilla and lemon rind drifting from within. She tapped the wood and called in her neat voice, which could be both elderly and practical at once, then waited the exact measure of a kettle's first stir before stepping inside. The tables that usually wore dull brown varnish had been set with paper cloths as white as good intentions, and upon them stood an army of covered tins and bakery boxes that had not been there last night. Each lid was tied with twine and numbered in a brisk hand that reminded one of grocery ledgers, yet no one had signed a maker's name as the committee required. On the floor near the back door, which gave onto the vestry yard, a damp rectangle showed where a crate had been placed and then removed, leaving the sort of ghost one sees when a picture has hung in one place for years and is suddenly taken down. Miss Marple noted the mark, and then the trail of fine sugar that ran, not toward the kitchen as it ought, but toward the porch, as if sweetness itself had lost its way. She stooped and touched a finger to the dusting, tasted with the caution of a prudently curious grandmother, and found the crystals to be icing sugar of a quality too fine for the village grocer's usual sacks. She straightened with the careful economy of movement that comes to those who have mended many seams, and her eyes drifted to the long table beneath the windows where the showpieces were to be displayed at noon. There, capped with a spotless glass dome, sat a handsome Victoria sponge, pale as a prim rose under a veil, with jam glinting in a narrow band, like a ribbon drawn tight to keep a secret. A card had been tucked beneath the dome, written in that same ledger hand, and it said only, "For judging." It did not say from whom, which in St. Mary Mead is not economy but concealment. She lifted the glass dome by a fraction to let the air breathe upon the cake, and caught another scent beneath the familiar sponge and sugar, a very slight tang that did not belong in a decent kitchen at this hour. She replaced the dome, and took 2 small steps backward, so she might see the whole of the hall as one picture, the tables, the boxes, the swept floor, and the tall urn standing sentry by the hatch into the kitchen. Steam did not rise from the urn, yet the metal was warm to the palm when she laid her gloved hand upon it, and the brass tap was sticky with something that had not been there last night. A film like the breath of jam cooled upon a spoon. Miss Marple let that sit in her mind as she went through to the kitchen, where the light was clean and small as a pin, and where 2 baskets of eggs rested upon the scrubbed table with a folded invoice laid between them. The invoice bore the church letterhead and the vicar's signature in a firm clerical hand, agreeing that the hall should be unlocked at 6 by Mrs. Finch and not a minute before. It was not yet 6 by Miss Marple's neat little watch, which had kept time with a precision that would have pleased any railway guard and which did not care for surprises. On the draining board, a jar had been set to cool, its label written boldly in red ink, strawberry, though the contents were a deeper, duskier shade than strawberries usually concede, and the fruit seeds at the glass were few and oddly shaped. Beside the jar lay a small paring knife, wiped clean in a way that convinces no one, and a coil of twine cut in short, efficient lengths, as if used by someone who does not pause to measure but knows the exact reach of their own fingers. She returned to the hall and stood very still, and in that stillness the world obligingly stepped forward to present its evidence. Outside, the milk cart creaked past, and the horse stamped in the frost, and from the yard beyond the vestry came the muted burr of a van's engine that had been reluctant to rouse, but now gave a little cough and was gone. Miss Marple moved to the yard door and looked out, noting 2 parallel tire tracks pressed into the white as cleanly as pressed lace, ending at the gate, where a careful driver had reversed and departed, without the untidy Flourish village men sometimes allow themselves in snow. At the edge of the yard, beneath the narrow sill of the vestry window, someone had balanced a small wooden crate to spare it the wet, and in the crate lay 6 ginger loaves, their tops glossy, their sides still faintly warm, and each wrapped in brown paper that had been folded with the exactitude of a draper's assistant. No note had been left with the loaves, only the same ledger numbers inked at the corner, and a faint perfume of clove that made one think of winter boots stored too long and brought out in a hurry. She was still considering the crate when Mrs. Finch arrived with the hall key on its shoelace and the indignation of a woman who has found her duties performed without her knowledge. She declared to the morning air that the world was going to the dogs, and that people who rose at unholy hours had only themselves to blame when health deserted them before Michaelmas. And then she saw Miss Marple in the doorway, and softened into civility as butter warms on toast. Miss Marple listened to Mrs. Finch's lament about responsibility and the decay of proper forms, and she agreed with a small murmur at the right moments. And then she remarked with seeming casualness that the cakes had arrived early. Mrs. Finch pursed her lips and said that early was one word for it, and that if the committee wished to avoid scandal of the muddled variety they had best count, label, and lock before the village woke and pressed noses to the panes. Between them, with the door properly propped and the hall lamps lit to a modest glow, they set to with pencil and paper and numbered the boxes again, and it was then Miss Marple saw that several numbers occurred twice, which is an accounting sin and not an accident. She marked the duplications on her sheet and tucked it into her reticule with the quiet satisfaction of a magpie that has found a bright thing and knows just where to hide it. By 6:30, the first of the committee came bustling, cheeks brightly pinched by the cold and minds full of good works to be done before breakfast. Mrs. Hargreaves, whose morning black had softened to grey now that a year had been observed, arrived with a basket lined in a spotless cloth, and in the basket lay a sponge so even it might have been measured by a rule, and a jar of jam she cradled as one might an heirloom that has not always behaved itself. She declared, with that air of bravery one adopts when one wishes the village to admire fortitude, that she had used her late husband's foolproof recipe, and that nothing could go wrong where he still advised her from beyond the kitchen door. Miss Marple smiled in a way that is friendly and uncommitted in equal parts, and her eyes rested for a moment on the jar Mrs. Hargreaves had brought, which was labelled in the same bold red hand as the jar in the kitchen, though the widow's penmanship, as known from choir rotas and subscription lists, ran to thin blue loops. Reverend Barton came next with his scarf wound earnestly about his throat, and a prayer for fair dealing on his lips, and as he crossed the hall he paused to admire the covered tins like a shepherd counting his flock. When he set his cane aside, a small burst of pale sugar lifted from the leather and settled upon the floor with the lightness of frost shaken from a branch, and he looked down in mild surprise and brushed at his shoe with a handkerchief that had known better mornings. He declared, to no one in particular, that he had not been near the confectioner's table, and then he laughed in that kindly, clerical way that hopes to lead amusement away from embarrassment. Miss Marple said something pleasant about the weather, considering how December behaves when it is not watched, and the vicar brightened and went to inspect the urn, which he declared a comfort to the faithful when warmed with tea and properly supervised. By 7, the hall filled with the pleasing commotion of a village turned industrious, and there were kettles joining their concert, and spoons, and the click of a dozen tins being prized up with butter knives that had been sharpened more by habit than by stone. It is at such moments that small deceptions either find themselves swallowed by honest bustle or stand out like a black stitch in a white seam, and Miss Marple had known many a seam to betray the whole of a dress when one tugged the right thread. She stood near the window, where the pale light had now lifted the fields and set the far hedgerows to their morning business, and she wrote 3 small observations in her notebook, using that fine, pointed script that had once made a schoolmistress hesitate before correcting it. First, that the cakes had arrived earlier than permitted by the vicar's own order, and that no key had yet been used to open the door, which suggested a hand with access and the confidence to employ it. Second, that a jar labelled as strawberry had the complexion of late summer plums, and that its seeds did not resemble the cheerful freckles of a strawberry's true face. Third, that a ledger hand had numbered the gifts in a uniform manner, and that the same hand had written for judging upon the showpiece near the window, though the village boasted no baker who wrote their numbers so sternly. She closed the notebook and slipped it away, and in that moment the clock in the porch chimed the hour, and the sound travelled through the hall like a reminder that time does not oblige mysteries by pausing. Mrs. Finch banged the hatch for attention and called the first volunteers to their posts with a cheerfulness that does not invite refusal, and Miss Marple took her place at the tea table where she could pour and listen, and allow the stream of village life to run past her with all its glitter and its silt. It was then that a small thing happened which would have been nothing on another morning, but which, in the neat ledger of Miss Marple's mind, required a line of its own. A thin envelope slid from beneath the main tablecloth when Mrs. Finch tugged the cloth straight, and it came to rest against Miss Marple's sensible shoe as lightly as a moth alights on a pane. She stooped and lifted it, and it was addressed to no one, and sealed without a stamp, and the paper was of the kind one buys in stationers when one has a cousin in town who knows which shelves to visit. She placed the envelope quietly in her reticule for safekeeping, and poured the first cup of the day for Mrs. Hargreaves, who had timed her entrance to find the urn at its hottest and the queue at its shortest, as reasonable women often do when they carry burdens and wish not to be seen to stagger beneath them. The village woke properly, and the bake sale morning shook out its coloured apron and started its brisk clatter, and yet, beneath the cheerful trade, there lay that faint oddness that attends a room that has been visited while it slept. Miss Marple, who had always found that human nature behaves the same in kitchens and drawing-rooms, if one only adjusts the recipes, allowed herself the smallest of smiles and put another coin into the collecting dish, because one should not let suspicion interfere with charity. When she looked again at the showpiece under its glass, the narrow band of jam glinted darkly, and the angled light caught a minute ripple on the sponge that would not trouble a judge's spoon, but which would trouble a mind trained to notice when a surface does not lie exactly as it ought. By 8, the church bell began to draw the lanes toward the green, and with them came gossip and good intentions, and the usual competition disguised as generosity, and St. Mary Mead took its places as neatly as knives beside forks. The cakes had arrived early, and no one had seen the someone who brought them, but the morning, with its warm cups and clinking plates, quickly tried to teach the village to forget what it could not explain. Miss Marple had no intention of forgetting, for forgetfulness is an indolent habit and not at all reliable in a crisis, and she had an idea that the day would not pass without asking for a great deal of everyone's attention. She smoothed the tablecloth, straightened the stack of clean saucers, and took a scone from a plate that had arrived with no name, which was not a sin so early in the day, and she tasted it with appreciation. And then, as if the morning had waited for that civilized first bite, the door opened wide to the village, and the charity bake sale began in earnest. Chapter 2. A Slice of Trouble. By mid-morning the church hall had settled into the steady hum that comes when kettles, small coins, and friendly gossip keep the same time. Miss Marple poured tea for those who said they were taking less sugar and then took exactly as much as before, which is arithmetic the human heart prefers to any done upon a slate. The showpiece table under the windows drew admiring glances, as a pond draws dragonflies on a still afternoon, and beneath the glass dome the pale Victoria watched the village with an air of modesty that seemed almost knowing. Ledger numbers sat like sentries upon the lids of tins, and Mrs. Finch kept a tally large enough to satisfy the short-sighted and the obstinate, which are not always the same group, though they shake hands surprisingly often. Miss Marple counted faces rather than cakes, and in counting saw who returned twice, and who hovered as if waiting to catch a thing before it fell. At the second urn there was the bustle the young mistake for importance, and among it moved Edie Pritchard with a neat apron and a prepared disapproval for anything that took too long. She sliced sponge with the brisk care of a nurse measuring medicine, and set the slices upon doilies that refused to lie quite flat. To this island of industry came Mr. Harold Larch, thin in the way men become when wives go before them and regular meals turn into an idea kept mostly on Sundays. His brown suit had been a better brown once, and on his cuff a thread had loosened and curled like a tail, yet he had the courteous manner of a man who does not wish to trouble anyone even while troubling himself. He spoke a word to Edie that was lost in the clatter, held out his plate, and received a slice of sponge so even its layers might have been surveyed with instruments. Miss Marple noticed the brief hover of Edie's knife over two near-identical cakes, and the choice falling to the right rather than the left, which might have meant nothing at all if life were not so economical with its meanings. Mr. Larch stepped aside to a quiet corner by a potted fern that had seen many harvest suppers, and lifted his fork with the look of a man who has promised himself a small pleasure and intends to keep the promise with dignity. He ate one bite and then another, and then paused, as people do when they remember an errand, only his hand did not go to his pocket but to his throat, and the pale colour of old parchment fled his face altogether. The fork slipped and chimed against the plate tipped and fell, and Mr. Larch followed in a hush so complete that for a second those nearest believed he had merely chosen to examine the floor and would stand again when he had made up his mind about it. A ripple of silence crossed the tables and broke against the far wall in questions. Edie put down her knife with a click that suggested annoyance rather than fear, and Reverend Barton was at Mr. Larch's side with a speed surprising in a man who dislikes hurrying in public. Mrs. Finch called for air and for space and for kindness, and forced a window that had always resisted good intentions until a strong hand insisted. Miss Marple reached the fern and bent, and in bending she saw what others did not see, because they were kind and flustered and bending at the wrong angles. The plate lay on its face, and upon the doily there was a smear of jam darker than the cheerful scarlet the village expects from strawberries with good breeding and sunshine. Near Mr. Larch's shoe, a minute crumb lay apart from the rest, as if it had been pushed there by a careful finger rather than fallen with the whole. From the fragment rose a very slight scent, like the back shelf of a chemist where bottles keep secrets even from the sun. She did not taste it, because there are moments when curiosity should keep its gloves on. Reverend Barton found a pulse and announced gently that the gentleman had fainted and that chairs, cool air, and reasonable space would serve everyone better than alarm. Someone was sent for Dr. Haydock, because in St. Mary Mead common sense agrees with habit that if a person falls in a public place, the doctor should be seen to have been invited to the party. Mr. Larch was lifted with care into a straight-backed chair, his collar loosened to one button less than respectability liked, and a smell of vinegar appeared when an old remedy was remembered in the kitchen without permission. The market resumed its hum by starts, for markets are shy creatures and edge forward only when they hope no one is looking too closely. Miss Marple examined the plate once it had been righted by a well-meaning hand and set to drip upon a nearby cloth. 2 smears marked the china's rim, with a clean gap between them where a finger might have pressed in haste. On the underside, a tiny grain glittered like frost. She brushed it into her handkerchief and folded the cloth away without hurry. Mrs. Hargreaves appeared at her elbow with the calm one learns when grief is obliged to behave in public. She said softly that such a thing was unfortunate on a day devoted to charity, and hoped poor Mr. Larch would be none the worse. Her eyes flicked, very quickly and quite involuntarily, to the glass-domed sponge at the window and then back as if a glance could be trained to heal. Miss Marple agreed that unfortunate was the proper word, and suggested the widow's basket be kept at the committee table until judging, since confusion tempts honest appetites into mistakes. Mrs. Hargreaves thanked her and moved away with the careful dignity of a woman who has practiced standing upright against weather. Talk had already started in the corners where talk always starts, and travelled in the manner of talk, gathering speed and ornament as it went. Miss Hart from the post office was certain the slice had come from a cake with a ribbon. Mr. Tom Ellis declared he had seen a scone chosen and then exchanged, and Mrs. Price Ridley, who arrived late but never allowed lateness to interrupt authority, announced that draughts were to blame and that fainting in public had become fashionable with people who ought to know better. Miss Marple contradicted no one and agreed with no one, because agreement and contradiction are both spades, and the wise gardener does not dig until she knows which bed she stands in. Dr. Haydock arrived with his bag and brisk manner and eyes that missed very little. He examined Mr. Larch, spoke to him in the tone men use with other men when there are ladies present, and declared the constitution sound though in need of quiet. As he turned away, his nostrils pinched at a trace that vanished among stronger perfumes of tea and good cake. He suggested a quieter room for the patient, and recommended the sale proceed, which pleased Mrs. Finch, for events that pause threaten to fail, and St. Mary Mead does not fail when roofs and hymn books need money. In the kitchen, Miss Marple rinsed the fallen plate beneath a thin thread of cold water. Edie Pritchard burst in with her apron askew, and the offended air of a girl more frightened than she intends to admit. She declared that men should breakfast properly before coming to public sales, and that she could not be held responsible for constitutions which tremble at decent sponge. Miss Marple agreed that breakfast is a virtue, and asked, in a tone that opens doors more quickly than keys, whether the slice had come from the tray on the right or the left. The answer came too readily. Edie said the right, and then flushed because it had come from the place in her mind that dislikes being seen. She added that she had been careful to use only the committee cakes and never the showpiece, which Mrs. Hargreaves had begged her to protect from fingerprints and greedy boys. Had any tray been moved during the first rush? Edie hesitated and admitted that when she turned for plates, a tray had shifted a little, and the knife had been laid upon a different cloth that did not belong to it, which she had briskly corrected and then forgotten. Miss Marple thanked her, and returned to the hall where talk had begun to knot itself around the name of Mrs. Hargreaves in a manner predictable and unfair. The widow stood straighter as one does when one feels eyes taking one's measure. Her hand rested lightly upon the handle of the glass dome, as if the cake beneath were a pet promised safety until the judges came. Reverend Barton made a speech about calm and charity and the rebooting of spirits, doing it well enough that people believed they had chosen calm all by themselves and returned to their shopping with relief. In taking up her place at the tea table, Miss Marple noticed a small constellation of fine sugar near the doormat where no cutting had been done. Each time the door opened, the draught took a few grains dancing across the boards, and when Reverend Barton crossed to fetch a hymn list he had dropped, those grains drifted obediently toward his shoes. She did not look down at them because it is rude to attend to a gentleman's footwear when he believes he is being listened to from the neck upward, but she saw all the same and kept it safe among the morning's small deposits. By 11 Mr. Larch had colour again, and the embarrassed smile men wear when they have done something involuntary in public and would prefer it to be thought voluntary if possible. Dr. Haydock allowed him weak tea and a biscuit, and advised anything rich be avoided until after lunch, and perhaps after that as well. Miss Marple carried the tea, and asked whether the sponge had been to his liking before it ceased to be so. He said it was good, very good, and then frowned as if a memory had pricked him. There had been a taste that surprised him, and then went away, a taste he thought might have been the jam, though he could not say why. He apologized for the trouble he had caused, as if embarrassment were a debt he could settle with courtesy. Miss Marple assured him no apology was needed, and crossed to the window to consider the pale band of jam in the showpiece sponge, which glowed like a ribbon dyed long ago and kept carefully in tissue ever since. The village leaned toward an explanation that would permit it to go on buying without remorse, and settled upon the old diagnosis of weak hearts, excitement, and insufficient breakfast. Miss Marple could hear that explanation being folded and smoothed like a clean sheet, and saw its corners nicely tucked by those who prefer tidy beds, even when someone is missing from them. Yet the smear on the doily had been darker than strawberries. The scent at the crumb had been the wrong sort of clean, and the tray had moved when Edie was not looking. These are the small facts that give the lie to a comfortable story once they are placed in order upon the mantle of the mind. At the main table, Mrs. Finch readied placards for judging, and reminded those nearby that display was not the same as serving. 2 boys were sent to guard the showpieces from clumsy fingers, which are more expensive than thieves in the long run. Mrs. Hargreaves watched them with a smile that trembled and then held firm, and told a neighbour that her late husband's recipe had never failed and would not start now. Timing, he always said, was the making of a sponge and of a life, and his book was kept in the pantry where it could not be interfered with. Miss Marple heard without appearing to listen, and felt in her reticule the thin weight of the envelope that had slid to her shoe at dawn. It lay between a folded handkerchief and a shopping list that had forgotten to include soap, and it reminded her of the tire tracks pressed cleanly in frost, of the crate balanced beneath the vestry sill, and of the ledger hand that had numbered the morning as if it were an account to be settled by luncheon. The bell for noon sounded, and the judges approached with clipboards, and the solemnity small villages reserve for ritual. A silver knife hovered at the edge of a jam tart and paused as if seeking permission to make a cut that might be remembered. Miss Marple stood where she could see the tables and the door at once, which is a habit useful in drawing rooms and halls alike, and she watched the eyes rather than the knives, for eyes often cut sooner than hands when a person thinks his share is at risk. The day had found its pace again, yet beneath it ran a quick little current that had not been there before, and that, if encouraged, would bring other things to the surface people had thought safely sunk. Danger, once it has been to tea, seldom refuses an invitation to stay for luncheon. Miss Marple refreshed the teapot and watched just a little more closely who reached for what and who, in reaching, made sure to touch nothing at all. In the corner, Mr. Larch dozed with his cup cooled beside him and the fern standing sentinel, and in the bright triangle of the window, the glass dome shone over the widow's sponge like the roof of a small temple that had not yet been profaned. The afternoon would have its say in due course, and it would be louder than the morning, as afternoons often are when gossip has eaten well, and Miss Marple suspected that one slice would not be all the trouble the day intended to serve. Chapter 3. The Widow's Victoria Sponge. Gossip in St. Mary Mead does not march with banners, it drifts like thistledown and comes to rest exactly where it intends. By the time the judges had taken their first formal notes, the drift had settled around Mrs. Hargreaves and the glass dome that guarded her sponge. She stood very straight with that composed look some widows cultivate when they will not be managed by either pity or prying. Her gloves were new black, and her smile was the older kind that has learned not to travel too far across the face. Voices near the window agreed that the cake was a model of proportion and restraint. Other voices agreed even more warmly that restraint could hide many things. Miss Marple poured tea and watched the little currents form and whirl and vanish. She had seen such eddies in washtubs and drawing rooms, and knew they always return to the same place if the plug is not pulled. Reverend Barton moved from stall to stall with genial concern, and a faint dusting of sugar still clinging to the welt of his right shoe. He consulted his hymn list, and consulted virtue, and consulted his appetite, and in the pauses between consultations he looked toward the showpiece table with kindly interest. Mrs. Finch kept order with placards and a pencil that had been sharpened to an argument. The boys set to guard the domes stood like small sentries, who had been told to look fierce and were not sure how one did that without biting. Mrs. Hargreaves lifted the glass and offered the judges a neat view of the crumb. The sponge rose cleanly with no sad belly and no cracked pride. The jam lay in a narrow band, as even as a ribbon on a well-behaved parcel. She named her jam strawberry, then repeated the name in a voice that asked to be contradicted, and would be offended if it were. Miss Marple drew a little closer, the teapot balanced on her tray as if it had decided to accompany her of its own accord. She said that the baking looked admirable and that the village would take pride in such craftsmanship. Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head and replied that her late husband had called it a foolproof recipe and that foolproof things keep households from waste. She added that he had written the method out for her before he took ill, and that his hand had been as precise in the pantry as it had been at the bank. A murmur said that bankers make good bakers, and another murmur said that bankers make good villains, and the two murmurs avoided each other with polite care. Edie Pritchard arrived with a clean knife and offered it for inspection, as if she could cut suspicion in two by showing a bright edge. She assured those nearby that the showpiece had not been served and would not be served until the judges were satisfied. Miss Hart from the post office peered and announced that she could see seeds taken in sunshine. Miss Marple, who had seen the jar in the kitchen with its few dark freckles, made a note without moving a finger. She asked the widow whether the jam was from the same batch as the jar in the pantry basket. Mrs. Hargreaves said yes, and added that she always made extra because waste was an unchristian habit. The word unchristian behaved as such words often do when dropped among neighbours. It brought the vicar at once, and it brought caution a moment after him. Reverend Barton praised foresight in matters culinary and theological, then asked mildly whether the extra jars were kept under lock, which was a careful way of inquiring who might help themselves if they wished. Mrs. Hargreaves said she kept her pantry door closed because tidiness likes privacy. She said keys were unnecessary in friendly villages, and looked at Miss Marple with a small smile that asked to be agreed with. Miss Marple agreed that friendliness was a fine lock when properly maintained, and asked whether the recipe book had been consulted that very morning. Mrs. Hargreaves said that it had, and that the pages had been turned with clean hands and a clean conscience. She spoke the title of the recipe in a level tone. Victoria Sponge, according to Mr. Hargreaves, foolproof and thrifty. A little rustle went through the listeners, the kind that accompanies a signature offered in public. Mr. Tom Ellis declared that a foolproof thing was exactly what was needed in a world that insisted on behaving foolishly. Mrs. Price Ridley said that foolproof was a word favoured by men who wished women to do as they were told. Miss Marple did not adjudicate. She allowed the words to lie where they fell and examined the cake instead. The top was dusted with icing sugar as fine as December frost. At the very edge of the lower layer, a minute wave had formed where the jam met the crumb and failed to lie perfectly flat. This was nothing to a judge hunting evenness, and everything to a woman who has mended many hems and knows when a thread has been pulled through twice. She asked, in a voice meant only for the widow, whether any part of the cake had been reassembled after cooling. Mrs. Hargreaves answered without pause, and said no, and said further that she never needed to patch her work, which suggested pride and suggested practice. Miss Marple nodded and stepped back one pace, as if the tray had tugged her elbow. She noticed, not for the first time, that the numbering cards set upon the tins had been written in a firm commercial hand at odds with the playful loops of St. Mary Mead. The same hand had written, "For judging beneath the dome at dawn." She let her eyes travel to the entrance where the draught slipped like a ribbon along the floorboards and picked up 2 shining grains near the mat. The grains made a tiny jump when the door swung and came to rest again in the wake of the vicar's step. Miss Marple added the picture to her morning collection without comment. Dr. Haydock returned to the hall with a nod that meant his patient would live to be embarrassed by tea again. He tasted a currant bun in the line of duty and said that moderation was a friend to longer afternoons. He stood a moment by the widow's cake and said only that the dome kept in the aroma admirably. The judges conferred in whispers that pretended to be thunder. They tasted a jam tart and a treacle slab and a fruit cake that could have been used as ballast and still found a following. At last, they arrived before the sponge that had caught every glance. The chief judge tapped his pencil, applied the knife with the solemnity of a small ceremony, and peeled back the cut to inspect the crumb. He pronounced it fine and even, and robed in good manners. He pronounced the jam bright and obedient. He did not pronounce upon the faint afterscent that tugged at the back of the nose and then tried to escape. Miss Marple saw him choose not to notice a thing he could not name without causing trouble he did not want. Mrs. Finch clapped the card into its slot and declared the sponge a strong contender. A small cheer rose from those who liked to be near winners. A smaller sound rose from those who prefer their winners to be someone else. Through it all, the widow held herself with quiet purpose. She told a clutch of ladies that her husband had believed one should never overbeat eggs or arguments. She told Edie that recipes belonged to families like portraits and should not be altered except for economies. Edie agreed, and then looked at Miss Marple as if to see whether the idea had been received as advice or as warning. Miss Marple smiled and poured more tea and let her eyes rest on the pantry basket that still waited at the committee table. The jar inside caught the light in a deeper shade than strawberries usually concede. Its label had been written boldly in red ink. The widow's writing on the choir rota was a finer blue that liked loops and curtsies. Such differences are sometimes innocent and sometimes not. The afternoon pressed its face to the windows, and the hall warmed by degrees. Coins changed hands and cakes changed allegiance. The showpiece remained under glass, as if it were learning how to be a relic. In the pocket of Miss Marple's reticule, the thin envelope shifted against the handkerchief like a small fish in a shallow dish. It had not been opened because crowds are a poor witness to private matters. It would be opened when the day allowed a door to close without apology. Mrs. Hargreaves pinned a small rosette to the cloth near her basket and thanked a donor for flour contributed last week when her own supplies had proved insufficient. The donor smiled too brightly and said that church people should always share. Miss Marple thought of the crate she had found under the vestry sill and of the careful folds in the brown paper around the ginger loaves. She thought of 2 identical numbers that had turned up on separate lids at dawn. She thought of the engine's single cough as it left the yard. Patterns are as plain as knitting if one holds them at the proper distance. She held hers at arm's length while she smiled and counted saucers and remembered how long it takes for a kettle to begin to sing. Toward 3 o'clock, a small disturbance began at the porch. Mr. Larch, restored and mortified, insisted on paying for the slice he had not finished. He set his coin upon the table and apologized again to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Hargreaves accepted his apology with a grave courtesy that would have suited a drawing room. She said that nothing was lost and that charity gains by a mishap only when kindness is added. Her eyes shone a little as she spoke and then grew still again. 2 ladies standing near exchanged a glance that said the widow was performing to an audience and that the audience had already paid. Miss Marple offered Mr. Larch a cup of tea with a dash of milk and a plain biscuit. He accepted both and confided that there had been an odd taste before he sat down on the floor like a foolish boy. He could not say what the taste had been. It had vanished the way a stray cat vanishes the moment a warm saucer appears. Miss Marple told him that cats, like tastes, do as they please. She told him also that he had done nothing foolish because the body has traditional ways of correcting the mind. When he smiled, she set his empty cup aside and crossed once more to the window. The glass dome flashed a thin line of light. Through the glass, the jam looked darker where the sun did not reach it. It looked the way a secret looks when the room is friendly, and the secret is not. Miss Marple arranged the teaspoons, tucked the tea-cloth straight, and made a quiet decision that would appear merely hospitable to anyone watching. She would purchase a modest scone at the next lull and take her saucer to a spot where gossip could pass by like a parade while her ears remained perfectly free. The widow's sponge would keep its place under glass. The village would keep its opinions under its breath for the present. The day would keep its nerve only so long as no one named what was troubling it. Miss Marple, who had never relied on nerves where thought would serve, let the decision settle like sugar and looked toward the door where the draught ran thin as silk. The story of the morning was not yet finished with them. The story of the cake had barely begun its second rise. Chapter 4. Miss Marple buys a scone. At the first lull after the judges had drifted away with their pencils like minnows, Miss Marple stepped to the end of the queue and asked for a plain scone with butter and a cup of tea poured not too strong. Edie Pritchard served her with brisk care, setting the saucer slightly to the left as if aligning furniture in a small room. Miss Marple thanked her and carried the plate to a table set at an angle where the whole hall could be seen in a single glance if one knew how to look without appearing to look at all. She buttered the scone carefully, as a woman does who has learned that a generous spread never yet betrayed a confidence, and she ate the first bite with appreciation. From that small vantage, the morning arranged itself like a village pageant. At the far end, Mrs. Finch enforced the sacred difference between display and serving, rapping lids with the flat of her pencil when hands strayed. The two boys posted to guard the showpieces stood with the solemnity of small sentries, learning their parts, and the delight of being entrusted with mischief that had not yet occurred. Reverend Barton made his way from a jar of coins to a tray of tarts and back again, presiding over virtue and pastry with equal benevolence. He laughed readily, shook hands often, and declared the day a success in a voice that smoothed worries as a warm iron smooths cloth. His eyes went often to the showpiece table, yet his feet took pains to carry him anywhere else. Mrs. Hargreaves kept to her station near the window, where the glass dome caught the light like a thin ring. She pressed the cloth flat with a palm that trembled and then steadied. She spoke gently and not at length, using few words to answer many looks. When strangers admired the sponge, she received praise with gratitude that did not seek more of it. When old friends offered sympathy, she let it pass like a wave that has already reached the shore. Miss Marple saw who lingered where they had no reason to linger. Mr. Tom Ellis had business at the raffle table, yet returned twice to contemplate a tray of ginger loaves, as if they had been a row of sleeping cats. He sniffed once, and then remembered himself, and bought 2 raffle tickets that he did not need. Miss Hart from the post office hovered near the urn where news collected as steam collects upon a lid. She asked questions with the air of a woman stamping letters and waiting for ink to dry. Edie Pritchard worked quickly and looked quicker, her hands cutting, wiping and arranging, while her eyes registered who watched her do it. Twice she checked the knives at her station and exchanged one for another as if a blade could be coaxed into better behavior by being given a different cloth to lie upon. Others avoided the cake table altogether. Mrs. Price Ridley limited herself to the preserve stall, where fewer explanations are required for a strong opinion. She spoke sternly about yeast and morals and felt herself improved by both. Mr. Harold Larch, now pale but upright, skedaddled along the far row of chairbacks like a careful crab and kept to biscuits with no jam at all. He bowed to Mrs. Hargreaves from a distance, and then remembered to bow again, in case she had not seen the first one. In the doorway, a thin draught continued its shy journey across the boards and made a delicate theatre for motes that had no business being noticed. The draught tugged at a few fine grains near the mat and sent them into small parades that ended wherever a shoe paused. Miss Marple watched them come to rest and thought about kitchens and about men who claimed not to go near them. She finished her scone and poured the second cup from the pot, letting the leaf settle with a patience that belonged to a different century. It was then that a small movement occurred near the main table, the sort of hesitating dance that belongs to guilty consciences and to people who are only trying to be helpful. A young woman from the choir volunteered to straighten a plate and discovered that it had already been straightened. She laughed, blushed, and retreated to the macaroon tray where fewer eyes were trained upon her fingers. Behind her, Mrs. Finch replaced the card on the widow's dome and pressed it down, as if flattening a fly that refused to know when it was dead. The vicar arrived at Miss Marple's elbow with his pleasant inquiries. He hoped the tea had strength enough for the morning and weakness enough for the afternoon. He praised the scones as examples of British character and then, remembering his role, praised the generosity of all present with equal fervour. Miss Marple returned his pleasantries and offered him a corner of her table for a moment of rest. He declined and said that a vicar at rest in public is a vicar under inspection. His cane clicked once on the floor, and he made his way toward the children's sweet stall, where pence multiplied through excitement. A little later, Dr. Haydock came to the tea table and asked, in a voice that had decided not to be alarmed, whether anyone else felt unwell. Miss Marple said that strength returns most quickly to those who do not seek it too anxiously. He agreed, and looked over at the showpieces with the grim affection of a man who has argued with cake and lost his case more than once. He lowered his voice and said that Mr. Larch would do, and that the day would not thank anyone who declared more than had already been declared. Miss Marple let her eyes slide to the window where the dome held its small weather of fragrance, and the narrow band of jam showed darker on one side where the light did not reach. She asked in an idle tone whether foolproof recipes are ever improved by being written down twice. Dr. Haydock smiled and said that in his experience, foolproof things are often proof against fools and not against malice. He left her then to tend a boy who had discovered that taffy sticks to the imagination as readily as to teeth. Miss Marple rose and made a moderate tour of the hall with her empty cup and her scone plate held as credentials. She paused at the preserve stall and asked the maker of a quince jelly whether quinces had been good this year. She paused at the raffle and admired a basket with a crocheted cover that had taken more hours than anyone would admit. She paused at the ginger loaves and saw that 2 bore the same ledger number in the corner of their paper, where eagerness had not quite wiped away thrift. Returning to her table, she set down the empty cup and slipped her hand into her reticule where the thin envelope lay like a folded wing. She did not open it yet. She held it with the light touch of a woman who had once kept letters safe for young girls who thought themselves older than they were. At the window, the widow received the judge's second circuit with composure. One judge asked whether the jam had set quickly. Mrs. Hargreaves said that patience is a jam's best friend and that rushing leads to bitterness. Another asked from which patch the fruit had come. She said the small beds beyond her husband's old greenhouse and that sun and sympathy had done the rest. Edie Pritchard coughed, as if to remind the world that practical hands usually do the rest, and then apologized in case anyone thought her meaning personal. A clatter at the kitchen hatch drew eyes for a moment. 2 jars rolled against each other and chimed the way coins chime in a purse. Mrs. Finch scolded the air, and then scolded the boy who had made the accident possible by being born curious. When attention drifted back, a man in a brown hat stood for an instant too long by the widow's table. He looked at the card with interest, and then at the cake with nothing that could be called appetite. He turned away, as if remembering an engagement, and was immediately engaged by Miss Hart, who wished to sell him a book of stamps on a day when letters were not required. Miss Marple tasted the last sweet crumb at the corner of her plate, and decided the time had come to walk the length of the hall, without appearing to collect anything but compliments. She stopped by the vicar's elbow in the porch where the draught did its homework, and observed a very fine powder upon the inner edge of the mat where no bag of sugar had ever needed to be set. She remarked upon the cold and upon the generosity of parishioners who had risen early to deliver such bounty. The vicar agreed and added a phrase about vigilance that sounded rehearsed and harmless. He moved on with a cheerfulness that did not entirely suit his eyes. From the doorway, Miss Marple saw the yard beyond the vestry, bright and crusted where the frost had survived the morning. At the edge of the paving lay a fragment of string cut short with efficient teeth or a very sharp knife. It was of the good butcher's twine that village women keep for roasts and complicated parcels. She filed the detail away and returned to her table as the bell in the tower called past. The afternoon shoppers arrived with their own weather of chatter and impatience. In their bustle the hall shed what remained of the morning's hush and became a fair once more. Yet even in noise a pattern speaks. Miss Marple heard it now as surely as she would have heard a wrong note in a hymn. The pattern said that someone wished the showpiece to be admired and not eaten. It said that trays had moved without being seen to move, and that a slice had been chosen with care from the right when the left would have been more convenient. It said that numbers had been written by a hand that did not love loops. It said that kindness had been made to look clumsy, and that clumsiness had been permitted to pass for kindness. A faint scent floated again, when a lid was lifted near the window, and was gone before Edie could frown at it. Miss Marple tilted her head the smallest degree, and remembered cupboards where medicines are kept apart from food. She remembered also the way sorrow makes a house quiet, until a stranger arrives with a covered dish. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves's pantry, of the book written by a careful husband, of the jam with its few dark freckles, and of the window where light falls kindly in the afternoons and less kindly in the mornings. There was time yet before the awards were read out to the hall. There was time to let 1 or 2 small stones drop into the village stream and watch how the ripples behaved. Miss Marple placed the empty plate on the return tray and smoothed the cloth on the table where she had kept her watch. She made a final round with a cloth for stray drops and a word for stray worries. At each pause she asked a question so simple that it would be rude not to answer. Do you find strawberry seeds troublesome in your teeth? Is this icing sugar from the grocer's usual sack today? Who was kind enough to open the hall before 6? The answers came with the ease of people who are sure they are not being asked anything important. By the time she returned to her seat, she had 3 more small pieces that fit where 3 small gaps had been. She lifted the reticule onto her lap and let the envelope lie along her palm. It would be opened very soon, but not yet. First, she would wait for a gentleman to brush at his shoes, as if dust were a moral failing. Then she would see whether the draft made its little parade again when he crossed the mat. Only then would she taste a crumb of information sharper than any sugar. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked, as any village grandmother might look, perfectly at home in the bustle and perfectly invisible to those who most wished not to be seen. The scone had been an excellent idea. It had made her part of the furniture and part of the day. It had left her free to see who meant to be near the cake and who meant never to be. The next move would not be hers at all, and that was exactly what she wanted. Just before we continue, if you're enjoying the story so far, this quiet unraveling of secrets, consider leaving a like. It helps more mystery lovers find their way to Silent Clues, and it means a great deal to us. Now then, back to our story. Chapter 5. Sugar on the Vicar's Shoes. The day, which had steadied itself after the little commotion, began again to behave as days do when they believe themselves watched only by clocks. Miss Marple sat with folded hands and let the hall move past her like a picture on a slowly turning stand. She had promised herself one more small observation before she allowed the envelope in her reticule its say. That observation obliged her to wait for Reverend Barton. He came presently, genial as a well-polished bell, making pleasant sounds and reflecting the brightness of other people's good works. He paused at the porch to greet a latecomer, and as he turned, the sole of his right shoe grazed the inner lip of the mat. The fine powder that had gathered there answered with a tiny leap, and a breath of white settled along the welt as neatly as frost along a hedgerow. His cane clicked once, he took 3 steps into the hall, and then, with the absent-mindedness of careful men, he brushed at his shoe as if dust were a moral failing. Miss Marple's eyes travelled no lower than courtesy allowed, which was quite low enough. A faint sparkle clung where leather met stitching, and a second shimmer dotted the heel like a constellation, just learning its own name. He joined her table with the smile clergymen wear when they intend to be kind and to be seen being kind. "My dear Miss Marple, you have been patient with all this bustle," he said. "I fear we have marched you up and down for our good causes like a veteran standard." Miss Marple replied that watching people do good seldom fatigues the mind and never the eyes when there is proper tea. She lifted the pot a degree toward his cup, and he shook his head as a man who makes a sacrifice at once noble and unnecessary. "The committee would have me avoid indulgence," he said lightly. "One must leave room for cake in heaven." "Earth seems fairly well supplied today," Miss Marple said, her tone demure, and her glance drifting, as by accident, to his shoes. He followed her glance, laughed, and brushed again. "I have not been near the slicing, I assure you," he added. "Mrs. Finch guards those precincts like a verger with a new mace." "I dare say," said Miss Marple. "Though sugar is a sociable thing, it will attach itself to strangers if given a draught and a chance." She observed the smallest stiffening of the vicar's posture, the mechanical adjustment of a smile to a fraction more brightness. "It is an old building," he said. "Drafts run about like altar boys when the bell is rung. He raised his cane to indicate the door, and Miss Marple noticed, quite gently, the pale dust caught in the rubber ferrule. "Did the bell ring before 6 this morning?" she asked, selecting a biscuit she did not want and turning it once upon its edge. Mrs. Finch believes not a minute before. Reverend Barton's eyes travelled briefly, reflexively, to the tower, as if a clock might be persuaded to testify. "The timekeeping of the devoted," he said, "is sometimes more exact than that of brass and gears." He added, in a tone meant to forestall fuss, that he had looked in early upon the vestry to fetch a hymn list and ensure the heaters had not sulked in the night. "The side door," he said. "A prudent circuit. I did not go near the table." Miss Marple nodded and agreed that prudence is a fine route when one's morning is as full as a collection plate. She offered him the biscuit, which he declined, and he excused himself with the pleasant haste of men who believe they have answered more than was asked. When he had gone 2 paces, the draught met him again, and a few bright grains shivered from his heel onto the boards, where they lay like tiny seeds waiting for the next shoe. Miss Marple took from her reticule a clean handkerchief and, under cover of rescuing a fallen teaspoon, dabbed at one of the grains. Between finger and thumb it crushed to a silkier dust than the grocer's usual sacks permitted. "Icing sugar, and of the finer sort." She folded the handkerchief away and rose with the unhurried purpose of a woman searching for an extra saucer. At the entrance she knelt to straighten the edge of the mat and, in so straightening, lifted its corner a fraction. Beneath it lay a minute drift along the threshold, as though someone carrying a sack had poured neither much nor little, but just enough to mark a passage. There was, too, a faint tackiness at one spot, where a heel might have paused. She touched the place with her gloved forefinger and found the trace left by jam or by something that behaves like jam until asked to tell the truth. She stood and found Edie at her shoulder with a cloth and a conscientious frown. "Best to keep the entrance tidy," Miss Marple said. "It seems the sugar prefers the porch today." "We've had no bag open out here," Edie answered. "The icing is kept in the kitchen bin with the flour, and I've been over it twice." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "And yet here it is, preferring the vicar's company." Edie looked toward the Reverend's retreating back, looked at the mat, and then looked at Miss Marple with the first small flicker of unease that comes when a fact refuses to take the place one has set for it. "I did see him near the door earlier," she ventured. "He said something about the heaters and the vestry draft." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. "Drafts are excellent at collecting what people believe they haven't dropped." She moved to the showpiece table and stood, as any interested lady might stand, admiring what was quite obviously meant to be admired. The boys guarding the domes had traded positions to feel more official. One, eager and conscientious, had planted himself with a heel exactly upon the faint scatter near the leg of the trestle and was grinding the evidence into innocence. Miss Marple thanked him for his vigilance and sent him on an errand for 2 clean teaspoons, freeing the floor from his activity. The widow, who had been speaking to Miss Hart, turned with a small smile that had practiced being brave, and Miss Marple admired the sponge's even lift. "Your husband kept ledgers at the bank," she said lightly. "I cannot help noticing a ledger hand upon the entry cards." Mrs. Hargreaves' smile did not change, which in itself was information. "Committee hand," she said. "Mr. Gilchrist wrote them out for us last year when Mrs. Finch mislaid the box of numbers and found it again only after we had made new ones." "Mr. Gilchrist," Miss Marple repeated, as if trying the weight of a coin. "He is very regular in his figures." "So he prides himself," Mrs. Hargreaves said. Reverend Barton reappeared just then to ask whether the rosette strings were at hand, and as he stepped near the table, Miss Marple noticed a tiny snowfall from his welt onto the clean floor beneath the widow's cloth. He saw her see it, and, with an apology for the weather upon the threshold, brushed once more at his shoe. "I have not been near the serving," he said again, more earnestly than before. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "It is sometimes the near which declares itself, and sometimes the between." He looked puzzled, as sensible men do when a woman speaks plain truth wrapped up modestly. He excused himself to mediate a dispute about the price of the last currant slice, and Miss Marple allowed him to go. She crossed to the kitchen, where the steam fogged the small panes and the clatter had the industrious music of spoons and intentions. On the high shelf stood the covered bin for icing sugar, its lid set neatly, its rim clean. She lifted it and noted the level, then replaced it exactly. Beside it, the flour sack slumped in the patient way. Flour sacks do. On the draining board, the jar labelled strawberry waited with the dignity of a guest who has arrived too early. The colour at the glass was a deeper dusk than strawberries tend to offer, and the seeds clung irregularly as though shy of being counted. She lifted the jar, felt its weight, and set it down. Her gloved fingers found the faintest stickiness on the rim. Edie, coming in with a tray, saw where she looked and said quickly that the showpiece was safe, that she kept all extra jam for the rolls and never near the judging table. "Very proper," said Miss Marple. "Have there been many extra jars today?" "More than usual," Edie admitted. "People like to bring something that keeps when they're not sure of their oven." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and when they are sure of their purpose." She returned to the hall in time to hear Mrs. Finch announce that the awards would be read within the half-hour. A little surge ran through the crowd, and with it came that particular tidiness people attempt when they believe photographs might be taken. Reverend Barton stood with his hymn list in hand, rehearsing his brief thanks. He had cleaned his shoes with a diligence that would have satisfied any sacristan. Only, as Miss Marple observed, the cleaning had distributed rather than removed, and a bright speck or two had lodged upon the cane's ferrule where it tapped. She stepped beside him as one does who has a small request not worth delaying the general good. "I am told," she said, "that the hall was to be opened at 6 by Mrs. Finch, though the morning seems to have started earlier." He looked straight ahead and answered as if they were both admiring the bunting. "I came to ensure warmth and order," he said. "The key for the side door is kept in my study for precisely such necessities." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "One would not wish to trouble a woman before her hour." He nodded, pleased to have his consideration recognized, and then frowned a little, as if the compliment had scratched where the skin was thin. "I did not go into the hall," he said again. "I looked to the heaters. I fetched the list. I prayed for dry weather." "And found sugar," Miss Marple said gently. He started, a small motion like the first twitch of a curtain in a draught, and then laughed. "The sacristy stores all manner of things," he protested. "Candles, polish, odds and ends. Sugar, however, is not among them." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Sugar prefers company." He left her then with relief, as men do when women fail to promise either condemnation or absolution. Miss Marple took her place once more at the tea-table and allowed the envelope to rest against her palm. If the vicar had been in the hall before 6, he could not have numbered the tins without being seen, for the handwriting was not his. If he had brushed the mat coming or going, the sugar might have found him there, as it had found the threshold. But sugar upon a shoe is a small thing. It does not say whether the foot belongs to a guardian or a guest. She glanced at the boys, at Edie, at Mrs. Finch's pencil pursuing tardy accounts. She glanced at the widow, whose hands were still, folded one upon the other like a prayer laid carefully aside until it was needed. A whisper moved behind the tea-urn, 2 women leaning close, words flattened by caution into the soft shapes of secrecy. Miss Marple did not turn her head. She let the sound enter her ear like steam and settle there to be named later. The bell struck the quarter. The vicar lifted his hand for silence and received something like it. Rosettes waited, and applause had already chosen its directions. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to the envelope and thought of wills, and of recipes, and of the close relation between kindness and opportunity. Sugar on a shoe, a jar with the wrong complexion, a hand that writes numbers without loops. Together, they made a sketch that was not yet a portrait. She slid the envelope deeper into her bag. The day had given her what she needed from sugar. Next, she thought, it would be Jam's turn to speak. Chapter 6. the jam that wasn't strawberry. The rosettes waited in a neat row as if they had been taught to sit still by a firm governess. Miss Marple did not look at them. She looked at the kitchen hatch, where a thin clatter had sounded earlier, and where the jar with the red label had stood like a guest who knows no one and smiles too brightly. The hall had taken a breath before the awards, that curious communal breath that is half hope and half tidiness. In that small pause, Miss Marple slipped through the hatch and into the kitchen, where steam sighed and spoons knocked small opinions against the sides of pans. Edie Pritchard was rinsing cups, with the zeal of a reformer cleansing a street. On the draining board the jar waited with its bold red word. Strawberry. Miss Marple unfastened the lid with the light turn of a woman testing jam for set. A scent rose that had very little to do with gardens, and very much to do with cupboards where medicines live. It was clean in the wrong way, sharp and shy at once, the kind of smell that tries not to be noticed and is all the more conspicuous for it. The colour beneath was a deeper dusk than strawberries grant, even on their most obliging days. The seeds at the glass were few and uneven, little dark flecks that did not belong to a sunny bed by a fence. Edie came up beside her with hands that wished to interfere and a face that dared not. "That is for the rolls," Edie said. "Extra jars were asked for in case we ran short." Miss Marple inclined her head and lifted a very little on the tip of a spoon. She did not taste it. She rubbed it between finger and thumb and felt a silkiness that spoke of more than fruit and sugar. "Will you fetch Dr. Haydock?" she said, in a mild voice that did not invite debate. Edie wavered and then obeyed, her conscientious shoes quick upon the tiles. Miss Marple set the spoon aside and took a second clean one, which she kept in her hand without using. The steam made small stars upon the window pane. The clock in the hall struck the quarter, and the noise of clapping rose and fell like sea against shingle. Dr. Haydock came in with the expression of a man who has already decided to say that everything is perfectly all right and ought to be left alone. Miss Marple offered him the jar and the first spoon. He bent, sniffed, and the expression altered before he remembered himself. "It is not strawberry," he said. His voice was careful, as if the words had teeth. "No," Miss Marple answered. "I once kept a patient company through a long winter who took to making cordials from her hedges. This has the memory of cherries about it, and of something people used in the older days when bitter almonds were a fashion in kitchens." She did not say the name, and he did not ask her to. He took a second, smaller breath, quick as a man who has learned to be wary of his own senses. "Cherry laurel," he said at last, "or something near cousin to it." His eyes went to the door of the hall and then back to the jar. "This must not be served." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "if you would be so kind as to put it where even kindness cannot find it." Edie made a small sound, the kind girls make when they discover that mischief is not at all amusing. "I took it from the pantry basket," she said, and her voice pleaded with the air rather than any person in the room. "Mrs. Hargreaves brought it with the sponge. I thought it best to keep her supplies together." Miss Marple laid a steadying hand on the girl's arm. "We will not trouble Mrs. Hargreaves until we know what there is to trouble her about," she said. "Please bring me the other jars marked strawberry." 2 more were found at the back of the shelf, one plainly strawberry with the cheerful freckles of honest fruit, the other wearing the right word and the wrong colour. Dr. Haydock examined both without comment and secured the darker one in his bag, with the quiet efficiency of a man who has once or twice helped the law without saying so. He wiped the rim of the honest jar with a square of clean muslin, a doctor treating an unoffending patient kindly after scolding a villain. "If there has been any ill effect," he said, "we saw only the beginning of it in Mr. Larch. A small taste might alarm the weak and be forgiven as faintness. A larger one would not be forgiven." Miss Marple nodded, but did not lower her eyes. "Would you say that a spoonful between layers could be masked by decent sponge and sugar?" she asked. "I would say so," he answered. "And I would say further that whoever prepared such a jar knew enough to hide the signature under sweetness." He closed his bag and straightened the strap as if that simple act might press his uneasiness flat. "Do you require the police?" Edie whispered. "Not yet," Miss Marple said. "There is a difference between discovering danger and declaring guilt. Let us avoid both extremes while the rosettes are being pinned." They returned to the hatch and stood a moment in its shadow. In the hall, the vicar lifted his hand and called for quiet, which the hall delivered in its own interpretation of the word. Mrs. Finch drew herself to her full importance and began to read names. The fruitcake went to a woman who had never admitted defeat to currants in her life. A tart earned a ribbon for patience under adversity. There was applause with that special warmth given to prizes that cost nothing to the applauding. When the sponge category arrived, a weight settled over the air like dust that has been disturbed and wishes to resettle politely. Mrs. Finch named Mrs. Hargreaves as the winner, and the boys guarding the table tried not to look as proud as they felt. The widow walked forward with composure, took the rosette, and fixed it to the cloth beside her dome with fingers that did not tremble. She turned to the hall and smiled exactly as long as a smile ought to last when grief has been asked to yield to celebration. Miss Marple clapped with everyone else and did not glance at the kitchen door. There are moments when the truth must be left to sit down by itself for a little while. When the noise became chatter again, she moved gently to the widow's side. "I wonder," she said, "might I see your husband's recipe book? You spoke so kindly of it this morning. You will think me a dreadful old magpie, but I have a habit of admiring good handwriting." Mrs. Hargreaves answered after the smallest pause that belongs to new distrust. "If you like, Miss Marple," she said. "It is in my basket, under the cloth." The book lay there, flour dust in its creases, a modest little volume titled in a careful hand. Mrs. Hargreaves opened it to the marked page and stood aside. Miss Marple read the method as one reads a letter from an old friend, noting where the writer breathes, where he does not, and where another hand has nudged a word. The margins told their own story in 2 inks. Mr. Hargreaves wrote in tight black lines that approved of thrift. Beside his neatness, there appeared several notes in a larger red script that had nothing to do with the widow's blue loops on the choir list. One red note said that jam should be applied thinly for elegance. Another advised that a teaspoon of cordial brightens fruit. Miss Marple traced the second note with a finger that seemed merely to admire. "Your husband liked cordial," she said gently. "He was no enemy to it," Mrs. Hargreaves replied. "He took a little after Sunday dinners before the last illness, when such things were set aside." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Cordial is a hospitable idea when it is what it says it is." She closed the book and returned it to the basket, with a word of thanks that sounded very much like a compliment. Dr. Haydock appeared again near the window and gave the smallest shake of his head. The dangerous jar was out of reach. For the present that would do. Miss Marple allowed herself to sit and appear to rest. She was thinking, not resting at all. The ledger numbers had turned up twice on different lids at dawn. The vicar's shoes had acquired sugar in a place where no bag had been opened. A jar had called itself strawberry while wearing the wrong complexion. The recipe book had acquired red remarks that did not belong to the house. Each thing was small, like a stitch tucked at the back of a hem. Together they made a seam that would not lie flat however much one smoothed it. She felt the lightest tap at her elbow. Miss Hart stood there with the fixed look of a woman carrying news that wishes to be sold like a stamp. "2 ladies have been whispering behind the urn," she said. She pretended not to be pleased with herself for knowing it. One of them said a letter must be kept out of sight. Miss Marple thanked her and admired the efficiency of the post office on days both ordinary and grand. She rose with her cup, which had not needed refilling, and wandered toward the tea apparatus, as if she hoped someone had left a good spoon for her to appropriate. Behind the urn, 2 heads bent together, and 2 voices pressed their consonants into caution. Miss Marple could hear just enough to be sure Miss Hart had heard correctly. It seemed the day intended to provide not only jam that was not jam and a recipe that was not itself, but also a letter that wished to be elsewhere. She took up a clean cloth and wiped a fictional spill from the corner of the table. Then she returned to her seat and folded her hands. She thought of cherries and almonds. She thought of signatures and of the careful ways people hide them. She thought of letters that alter the shape of afternoons. The hall brightened, as halls do when prizes have been given and money has been gathered, and everyone feels better for belonging to a generous village. Miss Marple's smile was mild and her eyes were very bright indeed. If the morning had told its tale in sugar, she thought, the afternoon would speak in ink. Chapter 7. A whisper behind the tea urn. Applause loosened into chatter, and the hall found its voice again. Miss Marple let the sound pass through her like wind through hedges, and listened for the notes that do not care to be heard. The tea urn breathed like a contented animal, and its heat made a small shelter for confidences. Behind it 2 women stood shoulder to shoulder, and spoke in a key that was not meant for the room. Miss Marple approached with a cloth folded over her hand, and the mild purpose of a person intent upon rescuing a saucer. She did not hurry, and she did not look directly. Words arrive more readily when no one seems to be waiting for them. "Keep the letter out of sight," the first voice said. "It will make trouble before the hymn is sung." "The envelope was to stay where we put it," the second said. "It would have been safer under the cloth than in any bag." "Not now," the first answered. "Someone is watching the tables as if they were pews." Miss Marple wiped a corner that was already clean and moved on, leaving the space emptier than when she found it. She carried the cloth to her seat and considered the envelope that had slid to her shoe at dawn and had kept her company ever since. It lay in her reticule between the handkerchief and the shopping list, where soap still failed to appear. It had not been where the women now believed a letter should be. That suggested either a second letter or a mistake made by those who had never learned to trust surfaces. She lifted her cup, tasted nothing, and put it down. The bell on the tower struck the half-hour, and the awards set villagers to rearranging their plans for tea with a new clarity about which cakes might be allowed home. Edie Pritchard returned to her station with the smile of a girl who has chosen briskness over nerves. She counted knives once and twice, and then once more, a ritual-like prayer in her hands. Reverend Barton stood in the doorway, cheerful as a notice board, and shook 3 hands in a row while his eyes visited the table with the dome and departed before anyone could accuse them of lingering. Mrs. Finch checked the takings, wrote figures that made sense to no one but herself, and packed the rosettes into their box with the tidy severity of a woman who believes triumph should be put away before it learns to misbehave. Mrs. Hargreaves accepted congratulations with calm that did not invite further conversation. She touched the ribbon on the cloth once with a fingertip, and then folded her hands as if to keep them from saying more than she wished. Miss Marple stood and drifted toward the urn, as a leaf drifts toward a shallow eddy. Steam fogged her spectacles and gave her the small privacy that old ladies are seldom given in public rooms. Behind the urn a space had opened where only a minute ago there had been secrets. Miss Marple dried her lenses on the corner of her sleeve and replaced them with care. She passed the urn and the cups and let her palm rest for an instant on the table edge where the cloth fell heavy toward the floor. Her fingers felt for a line that was not there and for a crease that might have been. Nothing waited within reach, which meant something waited beyond it. She did not lift the cloth then. She left it to lie as it lay. A conversation overheard is a seed that will sprout only if the soil is not disturbed in haste. She turned instead to the preserve store where Miss Hart was arranging jars, as a general arranges men, according to how best they might take and hold the light. "Dear Miss Hart," Miss Marple said, "a moment ago I thought I heard voices near the urn interested in stationery. Did you see the ladies who were interested?" Miss Hart pushed a jar of damson into strict alignment and looked satisfied before she looked at Miss Marple. "I saw the Finch woman," she said. "And the dressmaker from the lane, the one who sings alto and forgets the second verse. They were close enough to steam their spectacles if they had them." "Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Bell," Miss Marple said. "Thank you. Your rows are lovely. The post office must be jealous of such order." Miss Hart softened as women do when a compliment has been earned by the speaker's attention to detail. "Let us take a straight road with me," she said. "They do not wander unless someone has taught them the habit." Miss Marple smiled and moved on. At the window, the light was turning from bright to kind. The glass dome made a pale halo over the winning sponge. The band of jam gleamed soberly, and the sugar lay as placid as new frost. Mr. Tom Ellis came to admire, and left without buying, which is a village habit that keeps money in pockets and remarks on tongues. The boys who had served as guards were dismissed and ran toward the door, their shoes drumming a small song across the boards. Miss Marple felt again the thin draught, and saw once more the busy march of motes that should have been content to stay invisible. She let them pass and crossed to the kitchen where Dr. Haydock was speaking in the low tone men adopt when they intend to be obeyed without witnesses. He looked up as she entered and nodded. "It is put away," he said. "A cupboard with a key that even Mrs. Finch cannot find without asking me." "Very sensible," Miss Marple said. "And the honest jar?" "That stays," he answered. "Mrs. Finch will have a story about supplies and substitutions. She may even remember believing it." He glanced toward the hall, then back. "You heard something?" "A whisper behind the tea urn," Miss Marple said. "Two ladies in anxious partnership. They were not discussing recipes." "Shall I fetch the constable?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "Police are like thunder. They clear the air at the price of conversation. I should like a little more talk before the air is changed." She returned to the hall and took the longer way round the tables. At the raffle, Mr. Gilchrist was explaining the logic of numbers to a child who only wanted the basket with the crocheted cover. His ledger hand had written the tickets with tidy severity. At the main table, Mrs. Finch was tucking spare cloths into a crate with quick, economical movements. Mrs. Bell stood beside her with a packet of pins and a worry that kept time with her fingers. "Such a day," Mrs. Finch said, when Miss Marple drifted near. "We shall count and be done by 4, if Providence does not consider it amusing to send a cloudburst." "Providence is otherwise engaged today," Miss Marple said. "It has taken a seat by the tea urn." Mrs. Finch laughed because a laugh was the proper coin for such a remark. Mrs. Bell did not laugh. Her eyes moved to the cloth edge and away again, and the pins clicked once in her hand like small teeth. "Do you require help with the tidying?" Miss Marple asked. "It is kind to ask," Mrs. Finch said. "Edie will bring the cloths to the vestry when we have done with them. We must leave the main table for the photographs." A camera had appeared, and with it came the particular stiffness people lend their shoulders when they anticipate being asked to perform happiness. Miss Marple nodded and withdrew. Near the porch, the vicar rehearsed gratitude for a second time to a second listener and looked relieved that words still came when summoned. His shoes were clean now and shone as if they had taken confession. The ferrule of his cane kept a bright speck for itself out of habit or perversity. He caught Miss Marple's eye and gave her the smile of a man who appreciates cooperation from Providence. She returned it with one of her own that suggested sympathy with the clergy, and with gravity, and with the long employment of both. The shadows lengthened along the floorboards, and the draught turned cool. Miss Marple let the bustle swell and thin and swell again, the way busy afternoons do when their spines are made of clocks. Then she chose her moment. She went to the main table when Mrs. Finch had turned her back, and Mrs. Bell had been called to the door by the arrival of her nephew with a parcel of hooks. Miss Marple set down her reticule, laid both hands to the cloth, and in one smooth motion lifted the front edge just enough to see. Her eyes adjusted to the narrow gloom. A pair of empty crates, a rolled banner, a folded card, a length of twine, and nothing else. No envelope at all. She let the cloth fall into its old calm and picked up her bag. If there had been a letter there, it had moved to safer company. She stood very still and considered the path between fear and caution. Fear makes people hide things in places that are easy to guess because fear is in a hurry. Caution hides things in places that look like work. Edie came from the kitchen with clean cups and went by the vestry door as if it belonged to her. Mrs. Finch gathered the spare cloths and sent them after her with a command that sounded like gratitude if one did not listen too closely. Miss Marple followed at a distance that would have satisfied any etiquette book written before the last war. The vestry smelled of hymnals and old polish and the particular chill of rooms that are useful only in certain kinds of weather. On the table lay a neat stack of folded cloths, a string of numbered cards tied with twine, and a small box for odds and ends. Miss Marple stood in the doorway and observed the modest kingdom of backstage order. Edie came in, set down her cups, and began placing cloths by size. She did not see Miss Marple, which is the common fate of old ladies who keep their own counsel. The girl crossed to a cupboard, opened it, and then hesitated. Her right hand hovered above the shelf, as though it remembered an instruction it now wished to forget. She closed the door again, and gathered the cloths as if nothing had interrupted her purpose. Miss Marple cleared her throat very gently. Edie started, then smiled with an effort at cheerfulness. "I was only making the place tidy," she said. "A tidy vestry is a happy vicar." "I have known happy vicars who could not find their spectacles," Miss Marple said. "I wonder, my dear, whether any of the committee letters were sent in a plain envelope without an address. I found one rather early today, and it has been worrying me for company." Edie's eyes widened and then narrowed, which is a long way for eyes to travel in so short a time. "I have not seen any such," she said. "Mrs. Finch keeps the letters for the accounts, and nothing goes astray when she is minded to be strict." "Quite," said Miss Marple. She stepped back and allowed the air of the hall to rejoin the vestry. When she returned to the main room, Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Bell were conferring with their shoulders, which is the strongest way two women can speak when they do not wish to be heard. Miss Marple took her seat by the tea table and folded her hands again. She reviewed the day in small beads. Sugar on a shoe. A jar that was not what it seemed. A recipe book with two voices. A whisper about a letter that preferred the dark. An empty space beneath a cloth. Her reticule held one envelope that had chosen her. The table no longer held the envelope that had been chosen by someone else. Between those two facts lay the shape of an afternoon that wished to become an evening. The camera clicked, the children were given surplus biscuits, and the last of the coins made their chink in the tin. The bake sale, which had never been about cakes, prepared to pretend once more that cakes were all it had to offer. Miss Marple lifted her bag and felt the thin rectangle shift into the corner, as if it wished to be read. "Not yet," she told it. "A letter will say more when the room has ceased to listen." She stood as the hall began to tidy itself, and she smiled at the vicar and at Mrs. Hargreaves and at the girls who had done the washing up, without having been thanked enough for it. Then she moved toward the door and the evening air that waited to cool every hot remark. Behind her, near the tea urn, two women bent together again and whispered about keeping the letter out of sight. They did not know they were already too late. Chapter 8. The Envelope Under the Tablecloth. The afternoon took on the delicate rattle of crates and the polite scrape of chairs returning to their places, the sounds by which village events excuse themselves from having ever been unruly. Mrs. Finch counted coins into paper rolls with the air of a woman translating virtue into arithmetic. Reverend Barton rehearsed gratitude in a tone that would travel with equal propriety to the parish magazine. Mrs. Hargreaves folded her rosette as carefully as a letter and slipped it into her basket beside the recipe book that had behaved so well under scrutiny. Edie Pritchard fetched cloths as if the welfare of the Church of England depended upon a spotless hem. Miss Marple watched the tidy retreat as one watches a tide that has left a line of curious shells for anyone patient enough to stoop. She had not forgotten the whisper behind the urn. She had not forgotten the empty space beneath the cloth. Things that intend to be hidden seldom stay put when the room begins to empty, for concealment is a sociable habit and seeks company. She waited until the camera had clicked and the children had been paid in surplus biscuits for their good behavior. Then, with the easy absent-mindedness of a woman collecting her reticule and her good manners, she drifted toward the main table. The boys had been sent to fetch banners, Mrs. Bell had been called to the door by her nephew, and Mrs. Finch, intent upon her lists, had turned her back to count again, a figure that refused to be even. Miss Marple set her bag upon the table, adjusted her glove, and let both hands slip under the hanging edge of cloth, as if to smooth a crease that offended her eye. She lifted, not so high that anyone could accuse her of rummaging, but rather as one lifts to rescue a dropped spoon. In the narrow shade beneath, where the legs of the trestle made their little forest, lay the usual things that attend the end of charity. There was a folded banner, a coil of twine, a string of numbered cards tied tight as thrift, and this time an envelope so plain in its modesty that only guilt could have thought it invisible. Miss Marple drew it out with the same unobtrusive movement, and set it against her bag as if it were her own. It matched precisely the one that had found her shoe at dawn. No address showed, no stamp excused it from explanation, only a faint smear of flour and a thumb's clean crescent where someone had placed it in a hurry. She did not look around. She opened it with the unremarkable neatness of a woman who has been trusted with other people's secrets for longer than she admits. Inside lay 3 sheets folded once and again, and a covering note typed with a stiffness that suggested its writer had learned to type in a room where silence was compulsory. The first sheet wore the letterhead of Gilchrist and Bolter, Solicitors, Market Street, Much Benham, and below it a draft began with those plain words that rearrange families. "This is the last will and testament of me, Thomas Hargreaves, of the Laurels, St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple read quickly and carefully, in the way she had once read recipes written by ladies who omitted steps to prove a point. The house was to pass to his widow, and with it the furniture of the front parlour, and the clock that kept inconveniently good time. There were bequests to the church roof fund and to a cousin in Bath, who visited seldom and sent cards punctually. There was a small annuity for a retired charwoman, whose loyalty had survived 2 mistresses and a change in wallpaper. Then came the clause that sat oddly among the respectable sentences like a rook among thrushes. "I give the sum of £1,000, free of duty, to Miss Edith Pritchard, of Church Lane, St. Mary Mead, in gratitude for her faithful services during my late illness, and for such further assistance as she shall continue to render my wife in the management of household affairs." Miss Marple touched the line with a finger that looked merely steadying, and considered the phrase that carried more freight than a plainer one would have done. For such further assistance. That was a generous idea in a gentleman, and a generous hook in the mouth of anyone who believed service and gratitude should be written down where widows might see them. The draft was unsigned and undated in ink, though a typed date sat neatly at the top of the page. 19th September last year. A penciled note in the margin said witnesses to be arranged at Vicarage after harvest evensong per R.B. The hand that wrote the note was small and brisk, a clerkly hand that preferred straight lines to loops. Mr. Gilchrist, Miss Marple thought, with the amiable certainty of a woman who has watched him form the figure 7 on parish lists for a decade. On the second sheet, a paragraph had been struck through lightly and rewritten in red ink, the colour of tidy corrections and of tempers thinly controlled. The struck clause had directed that all recipes and papers relating to household economies be left to the widow at her absolute discretion. The new clause gave the same, but added, in that editorial red, that any notes concerning culinary cordial are to be deposited at the vicarage for safe keeping until such time as they may be of use to the parish bazaar. Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest admission that her heart had pricked her. Cordial again. Cherry Laurel had many polite cousins and an impertinent reputation in old pantries. She looked at the covering note, addressed to Mrs. Finch by initial and committee title. "Kindly retain until signature can be obtained," it said. "The widow is presently indisposed to alterations, but will, I trust, see reason in due course. R.B. to manage witnesses at convenience." The initials under the typed lines were R.B., written with a firm squareness that had not learned to curl. Reverend Barton, then, expecting to shepherd signatures as he shepherded everything else. Miss Marple read the draft to the end, where space had been left for 2 witnesses and the testator's hand. The spaces were empty. The envelope contained no letter of explanation beyond the brisk little note to Mrs. Finch. Miss Marple slipped the papers back exactly as she had found them, and resealed the flap with the gentle pressure of order restored. When she raised her eyes, Mrs. Finch was coming toward the table with the determination of a woman who has discovered one sum too few and suspects the world of trying to keep it from her. Miss Marple laid the envelope flat beneath her gloved hand and smiled with unembarrassed amiability. "My dear," she said, "I have been trying to discover which of these cloths belongs to the vestry and which to the Mothers' Union. They are so very alike when one is not in command of the proper list." Mrs. Finch glanced at the cloths and at the neatness of Miss Marple's hand upon something that might or might not have been always there. Her colour rose as accounts clerks' colours do when numbers have wandered. "That," she said, lowering her voice in the presence of prudence, "ought to have been in my keeping." "So it is," said Miss Marple, and slid the envelope toward her, as if returning a knitting pattern. Mrs. Finch took it with the breath of a woman recovering from a near fall in a public place. "An unsigned draft," Miss Marple murmured. "A very ordinary thing in villages where decisions stand in doorways and are shy of entering rooms." Mrs. Finch tightened her grip until the paper made a small protest. "It should never have been under a table," she said. "No," said Miss Marple. "Under tables are for crumbs and for children's secrets, not for wills." Mrs. Finch looked up sharply, found only kind blue eyes, and looked away again. "It was given to me for safekeeping until the vicar could arrange the rest," she said. "Matters were delicate." Mrs. Hargreaves was not herself then. "She has practised herself since," Miss Marple said gently. "And the clause concerning Miss Pritchard—" Mrs. Finch started, which would have been indiscreet had anyone been watching who was not Miss Marple. "A kindness," she said too quickly. The poor girl was in and out all hours, and Mr. Hargreaves could not abide to see devotion unrewarded. Miss Marple inclined her head as one does, when offered a reasonable explanation that fits into some but not all of the spaces prepared for it. "The note concerning cordial," she added. "That is an unusual subject for parish custody." "The vicar was of the opinion," Mrs. Finch said, recovering the sternness of her station, "that certain receipts would be useful for bazaars and that the parish might benefit from their proper management." "Management is such a comforting word," Miss Marple said. "It warms chairs before one knows who will sit in them." Mrs. Finch pressed the envelope flat against her ledger, as if an even surface would insist upon even virtue. "I will take this to the vestry," she said. "I should have done so before the rush." "Do," said Miss Marple. "And perhaps, for all our peace of mind, put it somewhere that is not beneath a cloth." Mrs. Finch departed with the straight back of a woman who has been reminded in public of the difference between tidy and safe. Edie passed with a stack of plates and a face that had not yet learned how to hide the quick leap of a thought. Miss Marple let her go and turned to the window where the light had faded to the colour of old pew wood. Mrs. Hargreaves stood alone with her basket. She had placed the rosette atop the recipe book, as if ribbons could keep sentences from moving under their own power. Miss Marple joined her and admired again the fine lift of the sponge. "I wonder," she said, "whether your husband ever spoke of making changes to his arrangements toward the end. People think of such things when they are kept indoors." Mrs. Hargreaves kept her gaze upon the dome. "He spoke of clocks and of leaks, and of other men's slovenly arithmetic," she said. "Changes did not make him comfortable." "Yet others sometimes make changes on behalf of comfort," Miss Marple said. "Solicitors are very respectful of discomfort when it signs promptly." The widow looked at her then, and in her eyes there was that stiffening one sees when a woman is asked to consider a possibility that has already visited her in the night and left the curtains moving. "If there were such papers," she said slowly, "they would be in the proper hands." "I am sure they are," Miss Marple said. "And if any find themselves under a table, I imagine the proper hands will be quick to remove them." A small silence sat between them, like a saucer put down and forgotten. Then Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head in a gesture that might have been gratitude and might have been surrender. Miss Marple left her with the dome and crossed to the tea-table where the kindly beast still breathed. Behind it there were no secrets now, only steam. She picked up her reticule and felt the familiar thin pressure of the other envelope against the handkerchief. She had given Mrs. Finch one letter. Another remained to her. 2 letters in one day are an indulgence, but opposing indulgences often balance, like sugar and lemon. She chose her moment and opened her own envelope with the same calm she had shown the first. The paper within was cheaper, the typing more uneven, the lines pushed to the margin as if words had been squeezed out of a reluctant ribbon. It was not a draft. It was a copy, and across the top someone had written, in that same red hand that liked to correct, for circulation if needful. The copy matched what she had just read under the table. It matched too closely to be accidental. At the bottom, a final sentence had been added in red, not part of any legal phrasing. If the widow will not see reason, reason must be shown to her, with the parish to witness. Miss Marple folded the paper and replaced it. She looked at the room and saw not cakes and trestles, not coin rolls and cloths, but people arranged as carefully as items in a pantry, each with a label someone had chosen for them. Miss Pritchard, busy and useful, and perhaps accustomed to being seen so. Mrs. Finch, exact and certain, the keeper of other people's tin boxes. The vicar, solicitous and practical, a shepherd whose cane had kept odd company with sugar. The widow, composed, holding to a recipe as one holds to a railing on a wet step. A will unsigned is like a promise made in a doorway. Someone had intended to bring it into the room and had not succeeded. Someone else had intended to show it in public and had nearly done so. Between those intentions lay a space large enough for malice to set out a table and invite jam to supper. Miss Marple fastened her bag and went to the vestry door, where Mrs. Finch had just emerged, with the look of a woman who has put a thing in a place and believes the place will hold. "Will you be so good," Miss Marple said, "as to tell the vicar I should like 2 minutes of his time before the hall is closed? I have a question about witnesses, and it will sound better in his study." Mrs. Finch blinked, then nodded. She went away at her precise clip. Miss Marple stood very still and watched the draught play at the mat, lifting 1 or 2 grains into a last little dance before they vanished into ordinary dust. The bake sale, she thought, had nearly finished pretending to be about cakes. It would soon be time for recipes of a different sort, the kind that name ingredients by their proper names and do not call cherry laurel by strawberries. She did not yet know whose hand had added the red to the black, though she had a short list as neat as any of Mrs. Finch's columns. But she knew this much. The envelope under the tablecloth had not been an accident. It had been a message that failed to reach its congregation. She intended to hear the sermon anyway. Chapter 9, Poison in the Recipe Book. The hall had begun that last fussy chorus which always follows charity, a rattle of crates, and a flutter of thanks that wish to be remembered in print. Miss Marple waited at the vestry door until Mrs. Finch returned with the look of a woman who has locked something and intends to keep the key in her mind as well as in her pocket. "The vicar will see you," Mrs. Finch said. "He is in his study for 2 minutes only, as there are photographs to conclude." Miss Marple inclined her head and went along the short passage where the air changed from pastry to paper. Reverend Barton stood by the little desk where a green blotter disciplined his correspondence, and a row of sermons waited like well-behaved boys. He gave her the smile of a man who wishes to be helpful and to be seen to wish it. "You desired to speak of witnesses," he said. "Briefly," Miss Marple answered. "I saw a penciled note upon a certain draft, indicating that witnesses were to be arranged after Harvest Evensong, per your initials. Am I correct in supposing those witnesses were never convened?" His expression made a small adjustment from genial to careful. "They were not," he said. "Arrangements were delicate. There was reluctance. I was asked to stand by until tempers cooled." "By whom were you asked?" Miss Marple said, as mildly as if inquiring after a missing teacup. "By Mr. Gilchrist," he replied. "The draft lay with him. He is a punctual man, and dislikes signatures with feelings attached." Miss Marple let her eyes rest for a moment on the pen rack. It held blue, black, and a rusty brown that had not been tempted for some time. "Do you ever write in red?" she asked. The vicar laughed, genuinely. "Heaven forbid," he said. "Red is for ledgers and schoolmistresses." I subscribe to blue-black for this world and hope for gold in the next." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, and the jar marked strawberry, which was not strawberry. He stiffened as if a draught had found his collar. "Dr. Haydock has removed it," he said quickly. "I have urged calm upon Mrs. Finch and will continue to do so. We must not ruin the day." "The day will survive truth," Miss Marple said gently. "So will the parish." She left him before he was obliged to ask what she knew, for she had no intention of telling him yet. In the hall the light had gone from eager to kind. Mrs. Hargreaves stood with her basket and the small rosette tucked like a paper flower between pages of a book that had grown older by keeping company with kitchens. Miss Marple approached and admired the ribbon without praising it. "Might I," she said, "study your husband's book again for 5 minutes? I collect handwritings the way others collect stamps. They tell the same sorts of stories and require the same sorts of tweezers." The widow searched her face and found there what she needed. "Of course," she said. She laid the book upon the nearest table, where the cloth had already been folded back for clearing. It was a modest volume with a grained board and a label written in neat black that did not flatter itself. The pages smelt faintly of flour, and more faintly still of something that waited behind the pantry door and did not like callers. Miss Marple turned to the Victoria sponge as a parishioner turns to a familiar psalm. Mr. Hargreaves's hand marched there in compact lines, the voice of a man who meant a great deal by the words thrifty and sure. At the margin, where morning light had already taken notice, there were red annotations broad enough to be noticed by any judge and worldly enough to irritate any housekeeper. "Apply jam thinly for elegance." "A teaspoon of cordial brightens fruit." "Beat longer if eggs are dull." The red was not a widow's blue looping hand. It was not the vicar's neat clerical print. It was not Mr. Gilchrist's clerkly prickle. It sprawled a little, opinionated and tidy at once, a committee hand that liked to be obeyed. Miss Marple rubbed one red word very lightly with the edge of her glove and found the ink recent enough to smudge if scolded. She did not scold. She turned 2 pages and found the same red at a recipe for quince jelly, where a line advised that bitter can be sweetened by a cordial, if properly tamed. She turned back again and lifted the lace of the binding where a ribbon mark had made a home. There, lodged like a pressed petal, was a scrap of paper cut from cheap ruled stock and written upon in the same red: "Leaves to be steeped until scent is present and taste is not angry." Miss Marple raised the scrap to her nose and found, as she had expected, the faint echo of almonds that did not come out of a bottle marked almond essence. The widow made a small sound at her side. "It is not my writing," she said. Her voice was even and empty at the edges, like a cup that has not been filled because one is not sure there will be water tomorrow. "No," Miss Marple said. "It is a useful sort of writing that belongs to people who label drawers and tell others where to put things. Did anyone, while you were occupied with nursing, undertake to put your pantry in order?" "Mrs. Finch ordered Edie to help," the widow said. "The vicar sent lists on occasion when the men were to be fed after a fence mending or a rehearsal. There was a great deal of assistance. It is an odd truth that help multiplies when one is least equal to supervising it." Miss Marple nodded as one who has watched charities breed in a house like kittens under a warm range. She took the scrap and slid it back under the ribbon. She pointed with one soft finger to the word cordial. "It is a cheerful word," she said. "People would rather say it than what they mean when the cordial in question has leaves. There are old receipts for laurel water, there are old mistakes, and there are old funerals." Mrs. Hargreaves closed her eyes and then opened them again. "My husband never meant harm at a table," she said. "He liked things done the way he liked them done, that is all. Men who are exact in sums often think the world exact in flavours," Miss Marple said. "They forget human nature will always add its own measure." She took from her bag a narrow envelope, and with a movement so ordinary it could have been entirely accidental, placed it lightly upon the open page beside the red word. "I found a draft this morning," she said. "It names a good many things and people. It also names Edie Pritchard for a kindness well rewarded. Men near the end sometimes confuse gratitude with policy. The widow's hand tightened on the edge of the table until the cloth could bear no more and creased where it had never meant to. She was faithful, Mrs. Hargreaves said. She sat with him when I could not draw breath and carry a tray at the same time. If he wished to make provision, it was his right. Quite, Miss Marple said. Only it is a delicate matter to put a young woman between a wife and a pantry, especially when the pantry has been invited to receive new labels in a red, energetic hand. She closed the book gently. May I take this for an hour? I will return it for your supper. The widow hesitated and then pushed the volume toward her as one gives a guest the photograph that will either comfort or undo them. Bring it back, she said. Bring it back, and if there is blame, bring that too where it belongs. Miss Marple carried the book to the kitchen, where Dr. Haydock had imposed order upon steam and aprons. He looked at the red notes, and at the ribbon, and at the little scrap that smelled of hedges after rain. He made a sound that began as a cough, and ended as a verdict withheld. If laurel leaves were boiled and strained, and the water bottled as cordial, he said, a spoon between layers would persuade a man of delicate heart to sit down whether he chose to or not. More would insist upon his not getting up again. Quite, said Miss Marple. And if a second jar, marked strawberry with enthusiasm, were kept at hand, a taste at the wrong table might be explained away as nerves. He looked at her over the edge of the page in the way doctors look at old ladies when they have remembered who they are. You do not believe Mr. Larch was the intended audience, he said. I believe he was an interruption, Miss Marple said. I believe the speech was written for someone who would be offered the winning slice after a very proper announcement. The widow, he said, or the vicar at his dutiful tasting, or anyone whom someone wished to rebuke under the sign of charity, Miss Marple said. She carried the book back through the hatch to the main hall, which was now mostly a place of brooms and echoes. Edie crossed her path with a bundle of cloths and stopped because the old eyes had decided to look at her. Your knife work today was admirable, Miss Marple said. I should like to see your hand at writing too. Would you be kind and write me a label for a jar, since I am forever misplacing my spectacles? Strawberry will do. Edie blinked and fetched a tag and a pen from a box by the preserve stall. She wrote quickly, in round letters that pressed hard upon the card, and ended in little tales that would have delighted a schoolmistress and satisfied no committee. It was not the red hand. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple said. She set the card aside and walked on to Mrs. Finch, who was checking her columns like a colonel counting buttons. Would you write a number for me? Miss Marple asked. The one that was twice upon the ginger loaves in the crate. I dislike duplicates. Mrs. Finch took up the nearest pen, paused, and reached for another. She wrote swiftly, stern figures without loops, and underlined the last with a firm straight line. Her ink was black. Her hand was the hand that had numbered the tins. It was not the red. Thank you, Miss Marple said. She found Mr. Gilchrist at the raffle, yet disentangling arithmetic from hope. Would you be so kind, she said, as to make me a little note for my memory? Witnesses after harvest evensong, if you please. He obliged in tidy pencil, the small brisk script of a man who does not waste graphite. It was not the red. Miss Marple stood by the window where the dome still shone and the band of jam had at last the look of something that would not be eaten today. Mrs. Bell, the dressmaker, came to fold the spare cloths, pins bright in her cuff-like teeth. Would you mark a hem for me? Miss Marple said, lifting the edge of the tablecloth an inch. Mrs. Bell took a tailor's chalk and made a neat faint score, then reached into her pocket for a pen to make the note firm upon a paper square. Her hand ran large and red, the letters tall and tidy with a slight rightward confidence. Miss Marple watched the pen, watched the flourish on the Y of strawberry as Mrs. Bell wrote it to be helpful, and smelled, beneath the ink, a breath of soap and machine oil and something sweet that did not come from pastry. Thank you, Miss Marple said. She looked from the chalk mark to the word, and from the word to the label on the jar that had been so boldly certain of itself in the kitchen. They were cousins. Not twins, perhaps, but near enough to share a ribbon. She returned the recipe book to the widow and placed her fingertips for a moment upon the cover as one touches a forehead to reassure. "I shall ask the vicar for a small meeting before the lamps are lit," she said. "Some threads do not belong in sewing baskets. They belong in daylight." Mrs. Hargreaves gave the smallest nod. Miss Marple went softly to the vestry door and found Reverend Barton at his coat. "Would you be so obliging," she said, "as to gather Mrs. Finch, Mr. Gilchrist, Mrs. Bell, Dr. Haydock, Edie Pritchard, Mr. Tom Ellis for his cart at the yard, and Mrs. Hargreaves, if she will oblige us. The hall will serve. 5 minutes only. There is a matter in a recipe book that touches more lives than cake." The vicar hesitated, saw in her face that her request was not a request, and nodded. He went to do as he was told. Miss Marple stood by the main table and laid the book upon it, opened to the page where red letters had offered cordial to fruit. The room emptied itself of bustle and filled with people. The dome still shone. The air was patient. There had been poison in the recipe book, not in the sense that a bottle had leaked, but in the more modern sense that a hand had leaned over, taken a pen, and written mischief where comfort ought to be. Miss Marple folded her hands and waited for the company to gather their seats. The bake sale had been a tidy stage. It would now serve as a tidy witness box. Chapter 10. The bake sale was never about cakes. They gathered with the air of people asked to admire a sunset when they had expected only to put chairs away. Mrs. Finch brought her ledger, as if numbers might defend her from surprise. Mr. Gilchrist arrived, still smelling faintly of pencil shavings and punctuality. Edie Pritchard hovered with clean hands and anxious eyes. Mrs. Bell stood a little apart, pins bright in her cuff, and a strip of tailor's chalk like a slim cigarette behind one ear. Dr. Haydock stayed near the hatch with a bag that had learned not to look important unless told to. Reverend Barton set his cane by the leg of the table and folded his hands upon authority. Mrs. Hargreaves stood very straight, the little rosette tucked into her basket and the recipe book beside it like a witness who had not yet taken the oath. Miss Marple did not sit. She stood at the end of the showpiece table, the dome glimmering between her and the small audience, and opened the book to the page where a red hand had offered cordial to fruit. "Thank you for indulging me for 5 minutes," she said. "It will save us all a great deal of idle talking later." No one laughed, which was just as well. "Dr. Haydock has removed from the kitchen a jar labelled strawberry which is not strawberry," she went on. "It contains an infusion of cherry laurel leaves and a few cousins from the hedgerow that have no business in jam. A spoonful between layers is a rebuke a heart cannot argue with for long." Edie gave a little cry and stifled it. Mrs. Finch drew breath to declare the impossibility, and then let it out again without words. Miss Marple turned the book so they could see the red annotations. "Here is where the idea was planted," she said. "Not by the widow whose hand is a neat blue loop, not by the vicar whose letters stand to attention, and not by Mr. Gilchrist who cannot resist a small figure 7 even when writing ordinary words. A fourth hand, red and tidy, added cordial to the house vocabulary and pushed it nearer to the pantry." Her gaze went to the dressmaker's cuff. "Mrs. Bell," she said gently, "you write a very confident year strawberry. It is a dressmaker's Y with a tail that knows how hems behave when they are not watched. I have one of your notes in my bag and another in the recipe book. They make quite a pair." A small stillness ran around the table like a mouse darting beneath it. Mrs. Bell's cheeks coloured slowly, a tailor's careful wash of dye. "I wrote remarks," she said. "Any woman may advise another about elegance. There is nothing criminal in improving a recipe." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "Advice is a civilized pastime." But the jar that matched the advice was not civilized at all. It was prepared beforehand and placed where it would be taken for the widow's own. Edie admits she lifted it from the widow's basket to keep supplies together. It had been put there for her to lift. She looked, not at Edie, but at Mrs. Finch and then at the vicar. "Someone had access to the hall before 6, she said. The cakes arrived early, and the tins were numbered in a ledger hand before the village was awake. The vicar was in the vestry for heaters and hymn lists. Sugar collected upon his shoes from the inner edge of the mat, where no bag had been opened since. He did not bring cakes in, but he opened a door and left its virtue undefended in the dark minute between a lock turned and responsibility fetched. Reverend Barton coloured and inclined his head. "I was imprudent," he said. "I wished to be helpful." "Helpfulness," said Miss Marple, "is the gateway used by more thieves than malice ever musters." She set her hand upon the unsigned will in its plain envelope. "This lay under the cloth," she said. "There are times and places to discuss a gentleman's last wishes. Under a trestle table is not one of them. The draft proposes £1,000 for Miss Pritchard and certain papers about cordial to be kept at the vicarage. It bears Mr. Gilchrist's clerkly note about witnesses and the vicar's initials for managing them. It bears also, on a typed copy that found me at dawn, a read sentence for circulation if needful, and a threat that reason should be shown to the widow with the parish to witness." Her eyes rested again upon Mrs. Bell. "We have had our parish, and we are at our witnessing." Mrs. Bell's mouth tightened into the line women make when they have already cast their stitch and cannot take it back without ravel. She was shutting every door, she said suddenly. The house, the money, the book, everything he promised would be for the village and for those who helped. He made a draft, and then he flagged, and she would not look at it. She would not have Edie kept on, and she would not release what he meant for the bazaar. "I meant to persuade her, to show her reason, as the note says, by making her ill at a public table," Miss Marple said, still gently, "by arranging that the winning slice carry a lesson more pointed than a speech, so that the will could be produced and her refusal made to look mean. Only your tray moved a little, and a slice meant for one person went to another. Mr. Larch has been spared by a smaller appetite and a sturdier constitution than your plan allowed." Mrs. Bell's hands trembled, and then went still, flat upon the cloth. "I did not mean death," she said. "I only meant to stop her for a bit, to have her sit down and listen. He was my mother's cousin. He promised my boy would have a chance with a loan when he was grown. There has been talk for years of leaving the old house to the parish in time, for a clinic or a lending library. She would give none of it. She thinks thrift begins and ends in her pantry." Dr. Haydock said very dryly, "Cherry Laurel does not do a bit." "It does, altogether." Silence followed, the kind that belongs to rooms where people understand at last which words weigh more than others. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you for telling the truth now," she said. "It saves a number of ugly steps. You put the jar in the widow's basket before 6, when the vestry door was unprudently open and the hall unsecured. You wrote your red encouragements in the recipe book during your hours as helper and dressmaker when the widow was in the back room or up with the sick. You slipped the envelope under the cloth so that, should there be a commotion, Mrs. Finch could discover a draft, and the parish could be asked to show reason to a woman who did not wish to be argued with." Mrs. Finch flushed and opened her mouth. Miss Marple raised a hand. "You were wrong," she said to Mrs. Bell, and her voice was kind and inexorable together. "About everything that matters. The house is a widow's right until she chooses otherwise. The parish may have its bazaars without receiving custody of bottles it cannot name, and no woman in St. Mary Mead shall be taught reason by having her cake turned into a weapon." She turned to Edie. "My dear, you were foolish in that you did not say at once where the jar had come from, and you were careless in your trays. But the draft that promised you money was not your doing, and you did not poison anyone today." Edie began to cry in that tidy way strong girls do when the worst has looked at them, and then turned aside. Mr. Gilchrist cleared his throat with professional gravity. "I will take custody of these papers," he said. "There will be no further circulation of copies. If Mrs. Hargreaves wishes to amend or to refuse, it is between herself and the law, and not for tables." Mrs. Hargreaves's composure wavered, and then steadied. "I shall consider what remains of my husband's intentions," she said. "I shall do it in my own kitchen with my own pen. I will not be frightened into charity, nor tricked out of it either." Reverend Barton bowed his head. "I have been too ready to manage what was not mine," he said. "I will answer for my part, and for my imprudence with keys." "Very good," said Miss Marple. "Doctor, you will want the jar and the spoon for your inspector. He will not thank us for being tidy before he has looked." Dr. Haydock nodded. "The constable will be sent for," he said. "It is assault with intent, if not worse." Mrs. Bell lifted her chin with the last dignity a stubborn woman keeps for herself. "My boy had prospects," she said softly. "There are always prospects," Miss Marple said. "Most of them begin with doing right hard, and only some with doing wrong easy." The little meeting dissolved in its proper order, like sugar at last taking tea's part. Mr. Gilchrist shut his pencil in its case and shepherded the envelope like a well-behaved client. Mrs. Finch put away her ledger with a snap that agreed to be chastened and not humiliated. Edie went to wash the last cups, because the hands must do something when the heart is nearly broken. The vicar fetched his keys. Dr. Haydock went in search of the constable and evidence. Mrs. Bell stood a moment longer and then followed him, an upright figure with pins that no longer looked like bright little teeth, but like small apologies. Mrs. Hargreaves remained, looking at the dome that had kept her husband's recipe from public harm by a fraction and a providence. Miss Marple stepped beside her and, with permission in her eyes, if not in words, lifted the glass. The narrow band of jam shone darkly, innocent as any adornment when left to its own honest name. "Your sponge is a good one," Miss Marple said. "It was good before, and it is good after. That is a comforting thing." The widow's mouth trembled, and then made a shape that was not quite a smile and not quite not one. "People will talk," she said. "They always do," Miss Marple answered. "But it will wear off. And when it does not, you will find that a cup of tea poured kindly is more use than 100 explanations." She set the dome back in place and smoothed the cloth. Outside, the vestry yard had lost its frost and kept its marks. 2 neat tire tracks that told the tale of an early visit and a quick departure. The hall itself, relieved of suspense, began to sound once more like a place where hymns are practiced and children are shushed and rugs are beaten with the moderate zeal of the respectable. Miss Marple took up her reticule and felt, with a small satisfaction, that it was lighter by one worry. The bake sale had never been about cakes. It had been about a promise made in a sick room, an unsigned will, a red pen that mistook tidiness for justice, and the old human habit of choosing a public stage for a private quarrel. She went out into the afternoon, which had finally remembered to smell of hedges and coal and ordinary things. Tomorrow there would be talk, and then there would be mending, and in a week the village would have arranged this day upon its shelf with the other curiosities it keeps. For now, Miss Marple did what wise people do when storms pass. She bought a small currant bun for her tea and paid without remark. "Thank you so much for joining us for today's mystery. We're truly glad if you stayed with us all the way to the end. If you enjoyed the story, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if it brought you even a little joy or comfort, consider leaving a like as a small sign of support. It really means a lot. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet mystery waiting just around the corner. Until next time, stay curious and keep the kettle warm.